they're telling kids, listen, Santa Claus is a lie. The little elf on a shelf is a lie. Am I a party pooper? Absolutely. The biggest in the world. Because if you teach children the truth from the beginning, they'll have a hunger for the truth. It's wrong to teach children lies. Even the fairy tales that seem harmless aren't. Because underneath, we're seeing so many children molested. And you're seeing in the little creatures, you'd be surprised how much child molestation and death to children. Pied Piper wasn't a nice guy. You know, he just was not a nice guy.
Well, you've been listening to Steve Quayle. I'm so glad to have you here talking about this stuff with me, Steve. And you don't know how hard I've been trying to get Steve to get here.
It has been difficult, Tom. It has been difficult.
But he finally did it today. We couldn't be happier.
Well, Tom, it's been enjoyable. I mean, this is exciting. We've waited a long time to get together, and I just want to thank you for making this time available to both of us, because I think the listeners and the viewers are going to have to consider some very strange but truthful events that have happened in history that will determine their future.
Well, all right, folks. Steve Quayle, the radio legend, in studio here at Skywatch TV. We'll see you next week.
You don't have to wait till next week. You can watch it right now. I am Clay Douglas. We're about to listen to Steve Quayle and Tom Horn. I thought Steve Quayle would be interviewing Tom Horn. It looks like Tom Horn is interviewing
Hi, Above
Steve
Average
Quayle.
Joe here from Survival Life, and I want to give you the Strike match, the world's first 100%.
Angels waging war in the unseen realm. Global events fulfilling biblical prophecy. Eternal life. What lies beyond mortality? From analyzing the paranormal from a biblical worldview to the discussion of cutting-edge science and technology. Conspiracy. Discovery. Special investigative reports. Unafraid to explore the challenging issues facing humanity. Welcome to another edition of Skywatch TV.
Tom Horn here.
Hi, folks. This is Tom Horn coming to you again from Skywatch TV. And as promised, I'm back with my good friend Steve Quayle. Steve, so good to have you back with us again today.
Well, thank you, and now we get to go for round two and really go for the depth, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we left off on the last program talking about how this whole idea around little creatures and big creatures and various kinds of creatures, the fact that there's evidence, some kind of a revival, there's some kind of movement around the world today. And I find it strange that it's happening at the same time. You know, there's big pits that are just appearing in Siberia, and scientists are baffled by it. And you know, over there around what they call it, the Norwegian
spiral.
Yeah, the spiral is so there's all kind of strange, kind of anomalous activity happening at exactly the same time that people are reporting an increase in the appearance of everything from the Loch Ness Monster to Bigfoot to a revival of fairies that are appearing. Strange stuff, right, going on. Well, you've written the book about it, of course, to respond to the issue, but to also provide the authoritative questions. But we left off in the last show saying, is this a biblical concept? Because our audience, of course, would be listening to us, and they might be very interested in the subject matter, but they want to know, what does this have to do with the Bible? Is that even a biblical concept, little creatures and doorways and portals?
Well, absolutely. Jacob's ladder. Great example. Jacob saw in his dream the angels ascending and descending, coming up or going up and going down the ladder. Paul talks about in his writings, the Apostle Paul talks about he knew a man once, whether in the spirit or out of the spirit, who was taken to the seventh heaven. Jesus appearing to the disciples and then walking right through, if you will, the walls. The road to Emmaus. Jesus showing up on the road to Emmaus. By the way, one of my favorite stories. Here there's two guys walking on the road to Emmaus, the town, and Jesus shows up and starts talking to them. Mm-hmm. You know, what the most exciting thing to me about the salvation of the living God is that Jesus is my King. He's my Savior. He's my Lord. He's the God of all creation, meaning that by Him, in Him, and through Him, according to Colossians 1:16-17, as an old preacher, you know that scripture, do all things consist and are held together, but that He would walk with us. And the fact that He calls us friends, I've often said to the Lord, I said, Lord, you sure have a lot of one-way relationships because you're a way better friend to us than we are to you. But that's what Abraham was famous for. He was a friend of God. So, yeah, there's so many instances in the Old Testament and in the New Testament of that transition point between our plane of existence, which we call, obviously, life, and then death. And now it's interesting that you use the word thanatos or thanatos. Death is now becoming the predominant theme in science fiction, whether it's the vampire movies or any of the science fiction, you've got to die, the super soldier program, which we've talked about, human enhancement. Now we've got even guys like Elon Musk talking about the dangers of that. So when we come to the whole idea of portals, I think it's interesting because the gates of hell is the greatest proof text in the New Testament that they will not prevail. Now, up until, I would say this, honestly, I don't know anybody that had the revelation before you did, because I'm a pretty well-read guy. That's not just, I mean, I have to be a researcher. But a gate doesn't basically do, it fulfills two functions. It holds something back or allows something through. You don't usually get beat up by a gate, okay? So it's not a weapon. It's a point of embarkation or debarkation. You know, it's a point where you come in or you go out. So Jesus is giving us a statement there that was so profound. But Tom, I believe the scriptures have time sinks to them, if you will. It's like a giant time. The book of Daniel talks about knowledge would increase dramatically, run to and fro, but that is seal it up, Daniel, for the appointed time. We've talked about that. And it seems like God has given you a combination. We're dealing with this massive time lock. And now the locks are starting to open. And I believe Cern is the master lock. And as that master lock is opened, it's going to like key all the other locks. Let's say you're dealing with a 6-point locking mechanism when Cern goes, you know. And what's the real purpose of Cern? Look, these guys, these entities, and I'm convinced that the intelligence of the scientific community is being supernaturally enhanced for this time in history to allow these fallen angels, the ones that basically have been, if you will, banished, the demons are disembodied spirits, we'll get to that in a minute, and all of the powers of darkness to come through. Now the word creatures is interesting because in the book of Giants are Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's on my website, stevequayle.com, and I know you're going to print it pretty soon, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, along with the books of Isaiah and all the different fragments of the Old Testament, the book of Giants is one of the most overlooked things. Everybody will quote the book of Enoch, but in the book of Giants it specifically states the fallen angels corrupted all of creation. The word for creation, obviously, that which derives from creation would be creatures. So the point is that we're talking about evil creatures with sentience. We're talking about strange, how do I say this, morphed entities and combined entities like Saturns or chimeras coming back on the scene. And most people would be fascinated to find out that in antiquity, they collected the bones of the giants. They collected the bones of unicorns. They collected this stuff. And believe me, I'm not talking about rainbow unicorns. I'm talking about the real things. And so now we're in a position where that which had been forbidden for mankind, and God literally locked them up, okay? In one place in the Old Testament, God says, you want filth? I'm going to pour you out about filth. In the book of Jude, we see the filthy dreamers, and filthy dreamers and ties back into incubus and succubus. And so there are portals. Now we see people again getting fascinated with a Ouija board. A Ouija board is the most, how should I say this, in my opinion, the most evil contact point that children and adults can harmlessly get into a world of hell they never even bartered or bargained for, because it's a very dangerous thing. So there are portals all around. The drugs, you and I, you know, came out of that generation, and we were always dealing with people that were looking for love in all the wrong dimensions, not just the places. And we watched psychic doors being opened. We watched people getting into, if you will, hallucinogenic reality. Now, fast forward, Tom, you know, from our generation, and look at what's going on. Kids are living in a virtual world. They're being programmed with monsters and every form of demonic hybrids. They're basically battling the forces of hell, but then now good is frowned upon and evil is absolutely elevated. Woe unto them who call good evil and evil good. That's what the prophet, that drove, I believe, Jeremiah crazy, you know. He's pleading with God. He's pleading his case and basically saying, Lord, how do I deal with this people? And God said, keep preaching to them. So it's important that people understand this. And so the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, deals extensively with portals. And we can use the word portal, but you can call it a dimensional ladder. You can call it a dimensional gate. So it's in there. And by the way, I want to make this clear to everybody. Little Creatures is based on the, when I say the gospel, as you know, everything I write comes right back to the Word of God, which is a foundation. Without the Lord's direction, none of this stuff would exist.
Absolutely. Well, and you know, you brought up the issue of Cern. So it's interesting that the Scripture has always acknowledged that there are doorways. You mentioned some of them in other radio shows you've done. You've talked about Jonah going down into the bottom of the sea. The Hebrew there, Baravak, a city of gates. The gate opens. He goes through the gate and he winds up in Sheol, Hades. He winds up in the center of the earth. Jesus goes there later and brings back the keys to some of those gateways. So now we know that not only do gates and doorways exist, they have keys to them. Of course, Revelation 9, and a star falls down from heaven with a key to the bottomless pit. And it also illustrates that the earth is dynamic in ways that the average person out there isn't even thinking about. They get in their car, right, and drive to Walmart. They're not even thinking about the crust that they're driving over the top of, and what the Bible tells us is inside of the earth itself. Recent studies showing isotopic signals coming up from underneath the crust of the earth, echoing back to a former world that once existed and was driven underground by some impact of the earth. What was that? The fall of Lucifer? We find now there's an ocean under the surface of the earth that has 3 times as much water as all the surface oceans. So the earth is so much more dynamic than most people understand, but it has those creatures in it that you've been talking about, many of them. But this is also part of prophecy, because prophecy also talks about the day when those gates are going to open, and many of those fearsome things that are inside the earth are going to be let out. Well, folks, we haven't even introduced the fact yet that from the last show, Little Creatures, this show we went in actually to your renewed book, redone book,
revised,
2nd edition book. Now and so we're talking about Genesis 6 giants, because among the things that are under the earth also are giants. In fact, Isaiah 13 opened the gates. There it is again, gates, doorways, up out of the earth comes giants. A moment ago you mentioned satires, because Isaiah starts talking about giants are going to come out of the earth, but when you get to the end of that chapter, he's talking about satires. Now, what's a satire?
Well, a satire is a half human, half animal. Usually a satyr was a male body on a horse's its hindquarters to its forequarters. You see them running around. They had sexual appetites like a wild stallion. By the way, God even refers to that when Israel turned away from him. He said, you guys are like a bunch of basically wild stallions going after everybody else's wife. So God uses that information. Isn't it interesting? And that's what the satires were known. Everybody knows about Bacchus and the bacchanalian orgies, etc. But they don't put the satyr, and the satyr, S-A-T-Y-R, is mentioned in the Old Testament.
Yeah, the centaurs and the satires. The satires, well, whatever.
Yeah, satyrs and centaurs.
Yeah, and so you had, Pan was a horned goat type being. He was the one that was being worshipped down there at the base of Mount Hermon in Caesarea Philippi when Jesus stood there and said, the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. So there's this constant reference, there's this constant acknowledgement that there is a warfare, there is a battle going on with what most people would say, those are just mythological beings. They never existed. They never walked on the earth. There's no such thing, right? That's what they say.
That's what they say. Over the years, I've met a lot of people. I've basically interviewed hundreds of people in the know. I could not have known them unless they identified themselves to me. But what they talk about, the genetic experiments and DNA that's extracted. For instance, most people don't realize that at the beginning of the Iraq War, there was so much more involved in that in antiquity, okay, and in the ancient artifacts and weapon systems. For instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh. I remember almost 20 years ago, Tom, posting a story and talking about the story that was posted. It was on the BBC that the tomb of Gilgamesh was found. Gilgamesh was half man, half god. He was a fallen, you know, he was a giant. And he went into the underworld, and he had to have the key to the underworld. But they were actually actively looking for his DNA. Now, I want to propose something. I don't know that anybody outside of you and I have ever talked about this, but suppose that all of the most evil people in the world, the world's, let's say, the who's who from hell, whether you name it, Genghis Khan or some of the emperors under the old dynasties of China. I mean, some of those guys killed 20 and 30 million people. Imagine the worst people in history being cloned. Now, because I want to share something, Jesus talked when an evil spirit goes out, it goes and wanders in the dark places, and it comes back to see if its habitation is fit for repossession. So imagine that there are people out there that are sold out to the powers of darkness that literally want to bring back some of the most malevolent / human beings that have ever been demon-possessed. And imagine this, that they would actually become repossessed with the same spirit that left when they died, which brings us to the difference of, most people confuse 3 words. They confuse the word Nephilim, they confuse the word Rephaim, which is synonymous with giants, and demon, okay? Now, why I think this is so critical is because everything has become a Nephilim. A giant is not a Nephilim. The word Nephilim appears twice in the Old Testament, once before the flood and once after the flood. Book of Genesis, chapter 6, and then Leviticus 13:33. And then when you go into the dead things from under the earth are formed, that word dead in Hebrew is either Rephaim or Rapha, and it refers specifically to the giants. Then you go to the demons, and as you know from the book of Enoch and the book of Giants, the demons were the disembodied spirits of the giants. And so when those disembodied spirits, in other words, a giant was half fallen angel, half human. Those were hybrids. That's why God told Israel to go in and kill every man, woman, and child, because they were not created in his image or likeness. You go to the book of Genesis, and God's very clear, after its kind and likeness, after its kind and likeness. And he saw that it was good. Devil comes along and destroys that genome. He wants the last vestige of humanity destroyed. And Jesus said, if those days weren't short, and for the elect's sake they will be short, there'd be no flesh left alive. So the goal of the enemy, even now, through genetic manipulation, through transhumanism, through all of the isms that are out there, is to do away with humanity. And basically they shake their fist in the face of a living God and say, you didn't do a good enough job. We don't need you. We'll live forever. We don't need you for anything, God. I think the Lord's about ready to call their cards. I don't play cards, but what's it called when you call someone?
The bluff,
Their bluff, okay? He's about ready, and I think the bottom line is that people have got to understand. When the Lord himself said, men's hearts failing them for fear of looking after those things coming upon the earth, notice up on the earth. Upon means to literally come up on. We've got to deal with, I guess you'd call the devil's sandwich. We've got fallen angels coming, the war in heaven, the devil's being kicked out, you know, and he inhabits the second heaven right now. Woe unto you inhabitants of earth when he comes down onto the earth. Then we got everything coming up on the earth. But the great news is Jesus said you don't have to be afraid of it. He said you don't have to. He said, I've given you the keys. Isn't that a wonderful promise?
That's right.
God's given us the promise. And the Bible says that we overcome the devil in all of it by the blood of the Lamb, the word of our testimony, we love not our life unto death. That means that God has more than given us provision. So if Tom Horn and Steve Quayle are placed in time and space, although I know you sometimes wonder if this is the right time or we're in the right space, okay, then we basically are fulfilling our calling to warn, but not enough to warn, to also equip the saints, okay? When Jesus said, I give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, it's amazing. Serpents and scorpions end up in the book of Revelation, and that's not a good time, Charlie, for people sitting around, what are those things where they, at a church, and forgive me, I've been out of church too long, but where they have a church where you eat food.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
what is that
the
called?
potluck or something.
Yeah, potluck. No, thank you. I'll go with the pot, but not the luck, and sing Kumbaya, okay? What we're trying to get people to understand, look, they are really, my emails, I get 400 a day, sometimes more than that in a 24-hour period, and the amount of oppression in Christians' lives, and look, I'm sorry to have to be the guy to say this, but I'm getting emails about people having those types of incubus and succubus experiences, and they're saying help, and praise God, there is help for them.
Right, and it's interesting that you bring this point out, and it's important actually for true believers to know that when we're talking about these little creatures and the stuff that's coming upon the earth and men's hearts failing them for fear, the very same text, like in Revelation, the pit opens and this demonic locust horde starts coming up out of the earth. But then what does God say? But do not touch those who have the seal of God upon them. So isn't that a great message?
It is a great message, but God didn't say, forget about those things coming upon the earth, You see, again, the problem with the people of God is they don't take him at his word, and they don't take him seriously. I'd like to make sure everybody's got a red letter Bible. Red letter Bible, as you know, that's the words of Jesus.
Right.
Jesus is talking the one about men's hearts failing them for fear, and God has not given us a spirit of fear. And so people say, well, God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but a power, love, and a sound mind. My answer to them most of the time is, then why are you afraid? Because people are absolutely, the first thing they'll do with truth is reject it, okay? Second thing they'll do is attack the messenger. Third thing they'll do is basically get everybody to agree with them so they have a justification for fear. And then the fourth thing they'll finally do is, well, maybe we'll admit that this stuff might exist. Well, between might exist and happening to you, that's the great chasm, and only the blood of Jesus can make it real.
Hey, Steve, we're just barely touching on some of the subject matter.
We have time again.
We will be in a few minutes. But Genesis 6 giants, I asked you a moment ago, and then like me and you always do, right? We get on the trail and go somewhere else. But the difference between this and the original version, I mean, what's upgraded about that?
Well, number one, of 60% of it's new, okay? There's 165 illustrations. In the first Genesis 6, there were probably 8 or 10 pages of illustration. The last part of the book, almost, I'd say 150 pages, by a gentleman named Robert Woods, who wrote a great record of all the ancient finds that have disappeared. It's kind of fascinating, Tom. I didn't know Robert Woods' work existed, 15 years ago. So what's fascinating, just as you're finding the old manuscript, and again, I salute you for Earth's earliest ages. And ladies and gentlemen, you must get that book. It's one of the most singular, important books. And when Tom asked me, what book would you reprint, meaning me, and I don't typically do that, I said, Tom, you've got to do Earth's Earliest Ages by Pember. That's the most important book. That book has spoken to so many people because Mr. Pember was a Bible scholar, and that guy was par excellence. And as we talked earlier, Tom, before we started, recording, some of these ancient guys, the older guys, they really had it. They had amazing knowledge, and they stood on the Word of God, and everything else with that, it was based on truth, so their conclusions were astounding.
And you have a documentarian that works with you, Timothy Alberino, and he actually produced a series that people can watch on YouTube that was based on Earth's earliest ages. And, of course, he also combined it with some of your research in the Genesis 6 giants. So this is the upgraded Genesis 6 giants that we've been talking about on the program today. The cameraman tells me I have to hold that book up like that so that the public can see it. Genesis 6 giant, now, the first version of your book really is kind of just as legendary as you are. You were one of the first ones that did a modern, thorough examination into the subject matter, asking whether or not this ever really happened and providing documentation that it did. So many of us that came along later, including myself, that talk about Nephilim and giants, I mean, you kick-started this whole contemporary conversation, but now it's been finally upgraded after 15 years, the Genesis 6 giants. Another one of your newer books, maybe we'll talk about this one if we can get back onto another program.
Absolutely.
True Legends.
We should, because
that one's going to turn us all, that's going to actually bring us together on some of our mutual research. And then the book that we talked about on the last program is your brand new book, actually, Little Creatures, just barely in print. These 3 books would normally sell for $120 retail. They're $40 a piece because, as you can see, they're as big as a phone book, chock full of information. We're also going to give you, as part of a promo for these television programs, the Apocrypha, which has the Book of Enoch and all of the other ancient records that were so important to those people that were writing the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Absolutely.
And that normally retails for $30. That is $150 value, but during these programs only. We're calling this the Steve Quayle collection. You get all 3 of Steve's newest, most important books, and we're also going to give you the Apocrypha for $99 for your donation to help us continue buying and expanding into television time. We got about 3 minutes, Stephen.
The phone number there.
I want to ask you something real quick. A moment ago, you mentioned, this cloning. They're going to start cloning the woolly mammoth. But the first thing that came into my mind, some research that maybe we'll start talking about on this program, and if you come back, we'll finish talking about on the next program. But they got this woolly mammoth out of the ice there in Alaska. There have been other things that have come up out of the ice. There's actually a very rich history that you've talked about before, having to do with the Nazis and what they were doing, activity that was going on there. We don't have a lot of time, maybe in 2 minutes or less. What else do you think may have been brought out of the ice that would have clonable DNA?
Well, I'll turn 2 minutes into an eternity of facts, okay? The point being is that what we were talking about earlier is Antarctica and the absolute fascinating history associated with New Schwabenland, the Empire of Ice, the area that's underneath the massive ice. And it's interesting because during you'll love this, this will really date me, but during the late 50s and the early 60s, the old movie actor Doug McClure made about, I think, 3 or 4 movies where basically he gets on a German U-boat and goes in under the ice. Well, Admiral Byrd talked about that, and there was actually a war in the South Atlantic, and most people don't realize this, in 1947, involving flying saucers, involving time dilation, involving everything. And for most people have got to understand, we'll talk about this, maybe do a whole show on it, but science fiction is the Illuminati's way of telling their adherents what they've gotten stored and what they've got planned. So what's fascinating, Tom, is if people want to just do a quick search and go on my website, and under topics, I think I got so many pages, I got to make sure I know where.
I've told you guys that in the future I intend to write only science fiction. And you need to know, before I was 14 years old, I had read every science fiction book in the Fort Worth Public Library. I know about New Schwabenland. I know about the Nazi submarines. I have read all of the research. That's why you should plan on getting my books, at least the chapters out of it that I'm going to release very shortly here. Back to Steve Quayle and Tom Horn.
It's at it sometimes baffles me where it's at, but it's Operation High Jump, and that was the official military name, Operation High Jump. So it's critical that people understand that, because we're talking about genetic manipulation. Chris Carter in the X-Files movie absolutely staged part of the end of the movie in the Antarctic, and I've been told by generals and special operations that there are parts of that are true, and there are other parts that obviously they can't tell. Well, I think that time is going to tell, and I want to say this to everybody. Jesus promised there's nothing that's hidden that isn't going to be made known. So we're going to show people that we're kind of like shoehorns. at putting into their feet the ability to walk in those paths of knowledge and understanding and be able to give people answers for the stuff that's going to overwhelm people.
Well, folks, as you can see, once again, every time I get together with Steve, we have the hardest time in the world getting everything that can be said in a very concise period of time. This guy's brain never shuts down. You can see why I love being with him. But if we can, I guess we're just going to have to do another television program, because I want to come back to that, because you said a moment ago something about, you know, what they might reanimate. That's been, and I said Alaska, I meant Antarctica, that's been brought out of Antarctica. But you and I also have a little curious history with Franz Josef Land. Maybe we'll start there in the next program. Tom Horn with my good friend Steve Quayle. Thank you for joining us today on Skywatch TV.
Well, we don't have to wait at all. And here we go talking about pre-flood structures, and we will be talking about that on this show with an archaeologist who's been on my show.
Whatever their stickers say, they'll all lose suction because their filters clog. Angels waging war in the unseen realm. Global events fulfilling biblical prophecy. Eternal life. What lies beyond mortality? From analyzing the paranormal from a biblical worldview to the discussion of cutting-edge science and technology, conspiracy, discovery, special investigative reports. Unafraid to explore the challenging issues facing humanity. Welcome to another edition of Skywatch TV.
Hi, folks. This is Tom Horn again, coming to you from the studios here in Missouri at Skywatch TV. And once again, so privileged to be able to have my good friend Steve Quayle in the studio with me. Hi, Steve.
Hey, Tom, it's really great to be back and to take the next series of amazing events and amazing fulfillments of prophecy and our mutual investigations and research expeditions going on concurrently, unknown to either one of us. The only time we find out what each other is doing is we do radio interviews together. So now we're beating that. We're doing a jump step. We're doing it on TV.
Yeah, but it makes me wonder what next is going to happen between the two of us. Maybe we'll talk about that in a moment with Timothy Alberino's project. We're going to be talking mostly today about this book that you put out recently called True Legends. And I love that title, by the way, because, you know, we have these legends throughout the United States of America, throughout the world. Everybody seems to have their mythos, and yet there's such commonalities in the stories that were told that seem to attest to a time when there really were things that were going on in the world that involved giants and things like that. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But first, speaking of giants, I learned recently that Timothy Alberino, who is your partner in crime, your partner in filmmaking, he's been producing a whole lot of just world-class, like mini documentaries that you guys are putting up. What's the name of your film company?
Gen 6, short for Genesis 6 Productions. And you know, thanks for bringing it up, because Tim just got back. Today's, what, the 21st, 22nd of... what month is this, April?
All right.
Yeah, you know, I keep strange hours, but Tim just got back from a 3-week trip to Peru, and we had a fascinating series of events that happened, and obviously Skywatch will be airing it. But what we're up to pretty much, Tom, is we're tracking down the giant cover-up that's taking place on multiple continents, multiple cultures, and I think I can explain to people the number one question that the doubters and the skeptics have. Well, where are all the skeletons? Well, Tim just returned from Peru, and fascinating, he was at Tiwanaku, he was in Bolivia, and he said in Bolivia they're undertaking a new dig, and the Bolivians just announced a whole new pyramid find. And what's fascinating is no matter where Tim has been in the last 3 months, Sardinia, obviously in Europe, Peru, Bolivia, and a couple points in between, the fascinating thing is, number one, they're always followed. Number two, everybody they interview that's, let's say, over 75 years to 80 years has a common, if you will, statement of who comes in to grab all the artifacts, especially when it's giant related. They're talking about helicopters landing at night. They're talking about big helicopters lifting very heavy items. And in Peru, for instance, one of the amazing things at a place called Sacsayama, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but the fascinating thing is that they ran into an engineer who is a secular engineer that said the ancients had to have had a way to liquefy the stone, because the stone in some instances flows in and pours in together, just like you and I, playing with Play-Doh, fitting piece A to piece B. Now, this is a secular engineer. But fascinatingly enough, that every place that Tim went, they were followed most of the time. It didn't matter if it was in Sardinia. The hush-hush, there were people that were actually afraid to go on camera. We had many times we could only record their voice because they were afraid of them. And interesting, them was the Vatican. Well, obviously, if anybody knows the history, and you well know, but of South America, Latin America, and even different parts of Europe, there's a absolute stranglehold on true artifacts and true history. But what was mind-blowing to both of us, and even the people that accompany, whether they're translators, a film crew, is just how touchy anybody was for filming. It was okay if you filmed on the right hand, but don't go over on the left hand. The right hand was like I would call staged artifact. Some of the most famous artifacts you see on the Ancient Alien series and all the different, they've been moved from a place where they really made sense to a place where they don't make sense. Tim said an interesting thing. Tim said it was like, Steve, you could see the pre-flood building and you could see the post-flood building. They'll let you see all the post-flood building you want, but they won't let you see the pre-flood stuff. In Bolivia, they were met by armed guards carrying machine guns. So that's what we're up against. Now, this is important, Tom, for your research, too. There are people working overtime to keep the truth of what is really out there in true history. I said in an earlier interview, they who control the past determine the future. If you and I are only told 3 points on a 12-point instruction to follow, we don't do good after maybe 4 or 5. We're going to mess it up. So by keeping people in this state of, I would call, I've got to be really careful here, I call mainstream media vomit brokers, okay? So by them only giving...
And that's being careful.
That's being careful. That's the best I can do. Either that or I have a mouthful of soap. The point being is that they want to regurgitate some facts, but most fiction, into the narrative, whether it's anything that you and I talk about collectively. Yet when you go to the desert Southwest, you and Chris go down there, Chris Putnam, or Tim's going here, or I'm going to a Native American reservation, you'll find out that there's a whole different world out there that these people who lived and their ancestors chronicled it, and people absolutely see the Norway spiral, but they can't accept the fact that, gee, how did the Native Americans, or how did, 4,000-year-old civilizations, why do they all use the universal symbol?
Right.
And
but now this is also part of a documentary,
right,
or a series of documentaries.
A series of documentaries.
So tell me about that. What you're doing, of course, is kind of producing documentation and in documentary format of a lot of stuff that you already have been investigating for some time on the presence of giants, but also even like you talk about Amaruca, if I'm saying it right, like the whole origin of how America got its name. And the Freemasons even write about this, don't they? Talking about where the knowledge of the mystical schools came from. Here, as it came from the plumed serpents? The
plumed serpent, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, both in the Aztec and Mayan history. The plumed serpent, Amaruca, or Ameruca, that's what the South American and the high cultures called America, and that's land of the plumed serpent. Now, when you see pictures of Quetzalcoatl, you know the classic representation is a feathered serpent. Almost looks like basically the reptilians in the old science fiction movie V with a whole bunch of feathers. I know that's simplistic, but that's what it is. So by finding out where all of these customs that came in the United States. There was a time, for instance, where people, even the major anthropology magazines, never wanted to admit that the Native Americans necessarily in the desert Southwest were cannibals. I remember fighting that argument 40 years ago. So the point being now is, or the Anasazi, the ancient ones, which you and Chris, you know, have talked, or the alien ones. What is the central theme in all these, by the way, is cannibalism. Now what we're seeing in the headlines is cannibalism. You're seeing it in all shapes and forms, whether it's the Christian, our brethren in Syria being slaughtered and basically cannibalized, their meat sold for meat in the market, and the world, especially the Western church, is silent. That makes me just go, I said this, the customs of the ancient ones will come into the contemporary times, and you'll know we're in the end times. And that's exactly, now, people didn't, there was very little cannibalism 20 years ago. Maybe the case of the airliner that went down in the Andes, you know, and situation survival, but there was never, you know, basically cookbooks on the internet and people advertising for people to come and basically let someone kill them, as in the case of Germany, and eat them.
It's interesting because, you know, you mentioned me and Chris had been doing, again, investigative work, not even knowing you were working on this brand new book, True Legends, where you're taking the stories that had been told by many of the American Indian tribes and the legends of the stories. I want to ask you in a few moments about the Smithsonian. Don't let me forget to ask you about that. But while you were doing that, we were actually going to the Four Corners area. Chris went down to the, you know, to the southern end of the Anasazi Trail, as I started calling it, in Sedona. And what does he find there in Sedona but the presence of the Vatican, you know, had built, and in an area where nobody else is allowed to build. They get to build this kind of Catholic thing. It's the church. It's a monastery sticking out of the side of the mountain. We found the same thing on the top of Mount Graham. Everywhere there seems to be these portals and these entities, it's like there's a very strong presence there, as if they know something we don't know, or they're pursuing something ahead of us. But the point I was going to make is I got a chance to sit down with Dr. Don Mose. And he's a third-generation medicine man. He is he's an academic, or he's a retired academic, the Navajo Nation. I should have brought his book and showed it to you, where he had an artist depict giants that used to be in the United States. Some of them, it look like they're 200 feet tall. It took whole tribes to bring them down. And when they finally got them down and cut their head off, there was so much blood that came out, it flowed down into the valley like it was forming a small river. This is in the books that he had written. Well, here's the interesting thing. I'm interviewing him, and I ask him, so tell us, what happened to the Anasazi? And he starts, you know, telling the tale that they hear in school. Well, there was a drought, and then 7 years of a drought, they follow, you know, they start migrating slowly away. But I raised questions about that. I said, and yet when the archaeologists first went into those cliff dwellings, they found that they had disappeared overnight. They didn't slowly migrate away. They left everything, bags of salt that would have been like gold, right? So where did they go? Well, he looks at the camera. We have this on film. And he says, well, I shouldn't tell you this, but if you were to ask my great-grandfather, this is a story that he would have told. And Steve, it was like he had opened up True Legends and started reading, because he talks of a portal, the serpent, the deceiver that comes through the portal, the six-toed giants. But he also says that this deceiver started teaching the people cannibalism. That was my whole point. They started eating one another. The giants were eating them. We did follow-up research that isn't even in our book, where we found old university archaeological digs where they found Anasazi that had literally been ripped apart. They found their bones, the sinew, the flesh had been literally ripped apart and left on the ground.
The rib cage is split.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny you would say that, Tom, because, again, this illustrates it. In the book Long Walkers, a pilot who was an active-duty Air Force pilot flew into Bagram Air Force Base, I believe, in the year 2005. And I know him personally, came to my store, bona fides, verified, etc., and told this story. Now, you just talked about being ripped apart. Well, he was tasked with flying a dead giant who had cannibalized a squad of Marines that were going in looking for Bin Laden's boys, you know, Al-Qaeda in the caves and everything. And interestingly enough, the very description that was given to the team that basically produced the giant cadaver form. It takes a special way of killing giants. He said it was like their rib cages were ripped apart. Isn't that interesting? So you're in the desert Southwest talking to that very intelligent man, and his grandfather, I would tell you this, would know more about the truth than all the twisting.
Well, Dr. Mose is a third-generation Navajo Nation medicine man and oral historian whose books are used in their schools. So, yeah, he's no Johnny-come-lately.
I think the big discrepancy between fact and fantasy is that as the older generation dies off, this is why Tim, I mean, he's sitting on a reed island in Lake Titicaca, okay? And he's interviewing I think is it like a 75 or 80-year-old man who only speaks the language that has to be translated into Spanish. Now, Tim speaks perfect Spanish and lived in Peru, so that helps. But it's always the same story. So they're talking about the helicopters coming in, talking about cannibalistic giants, and how's this for an interesting story? They go to a place called Amaramuru, which is a Stargate location, an actual Stargate. So they have shamans there, and they're ringing a bell, and they're taking a metal object, and like you would take your thumb and make a crystal glass hum, they're basically making all these different noises. Now, I've been told by the people that know a lot about this stuff that Stargates work on words, sounds, and a power source. I never found out what the power source was. But while Tim, Vinny, and Benny, those are the three guys in the crew, are camped out at the Stargate, it rains, it hails, they've got this on video, and he said it was the most strangest thing they've ever seen, because around them everything was clear, but right where they were was, if you will, this directed hailstorm. He said it was so furious that they had to go and get half the village to come and pull their car out and dig their car out of the mud, because you know, basically they had gone up there to see this event. But the strangest lightning, the strangest sound. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that in your findings and our corollary investigation research, the common denominators are always the same. I think I've told you this before, I mentioned it on the radio. I was contacted by a major film studio years ago, 3 or 4, maybe 5 years ago, and they wanted to know if I would be willing to make the Giants rewrite a movie script that I had written, and, you know, basically making the Giants nice people. And I said, well, fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Doesn't sound to me like they're eating burgers, okay? So the point being is that even Shrek, there was a cartoon, and they made Shrek, an ogre is a human-eating monster, O-G-R-E. Not Congress, because there's some of those guys too. Those just eat the fruit of the land. But the point being is that we're seeing now in the corollary investigations that we're doing, the common denominators. And the Anasazi, you know, it's fascinating. You jump to Easter Island now, and Easter Island used to have a curse, and the curse was, your grandmother's flesh lies rotting in my teeth. You know, lovely, huh? That was a National Geographic. So there's been a cover-up, because, again, what's troubling to me is that I see the parasitical appetites of demons coming into common acceptance. I don't play video games. I can honestly say I don't think I've ever played one more than 2 minutes, and then my attention span was over, and my manual dexterity is not what it used to be. I was teasing about Joe. I love the way he plays the guitar. You know, my thumbs and fingers don't move that fast anymore. But the thing that's fascinating to me is that the theme in these video games is getting darker and darker. Do you know what the #1 selling comic book and cartoon series is in Japan? It's about man-eating giants, okay? And these are like 200-foot tall giants. So when you asked me earlier what's the difference about this Genesis 6 revised volume versus the first one I wrote, is the Woods document, they're 200, 300, 400-foot giants, especially Polyphemus. That goes right back to the Cyclops. That goes right back to Jason the Argonauts. It goes right back. And the Greeks, you know, for instance, one of the, well, 2 ancient wonders of the world was, good night, the Colossus of Rhodes. That was just, that was 99 feet, and it spanned the harbor. Then you have the Temple of Zeus, which is kind of a portrayal on Genesis 6 giants, and that was a real temple where real giants sat. and held court. And these guys were in their 40 and 50 and 60 foot tall. So, well, Paul Bunyan and all those stories may have been dismissed when you found out from your Native American contact, and I'm hearing the same thing from my contacts around the world, because when you and I go on talk radio, it goes all over the world, and millions of people listen, and we'll hear from Australia, we'll hear from Siberia, we'll hear from all over the place. I mean, I've heard people say, we listen to you on satellite radio, and I said, you mean like Sirius? He said, oh no, we're on satellite. We're getting you from the satellite downlink, so they must be in some research facility or have some capability. But those are the kind of people that make contact with us to give us the leads we follow up. And so I think it's time, I refer to this over and over, it's time for those hidden things to be revealed. And again, the people of God have nothing to fear. Now, if they know what's coming and we're articulating it, defining it, and preparing them for it, then they will deal with it in victory versus in subterfuge, defeat, and total panic.
We've been talking here with my good friend Steve Quayle. You can see why I love talking to Steve, right? How do you do this with no notes? I mean, you have a mind like a steel trap. Right now we've been talking about the book True Legends, and this is one of your newest books. This just only came out just a few months ago.
No, that one came out about a year ago.
About 1 year
Yeah,
ago.
Little Creatures about 6 months ago.
Actually, this is even newer than that,
and
isn't it?
that's new. That's like 2 weeks old.
Little Creatures, and then Genesis 6 Giants. This is actually the what is this, a third edition, or it's your new edition? It's an expanded?
New edition, but if it were going by the old line, it would be the 10th printing of it.
Okay. But we're making all three of Steve Quayle's books available to you at a very special price. We're also throwing in we typically retail this for $30, Volume 1 of the Researcher's Library of Ancient Texts. This is the Apocrypha, but it has many of the books that you'll find sourced in Steve's books, like the Book of Enoch and some of the other ancient works like Jubilees, which also talks about the giants, also talks about the return of the giants and the fallen angels. Normally, these books all sell for $40 each because they're 2 to 3 times as big as anybody else's works. That would normally, between those 3 books and the Apocrypha, that would be a $150 value, but we are making that available to you during these programs only for a special price of $99. If you call in the number that's on the screen, or if you visit skywatchtv.com, you will be able to get these books from our online store. If you call in, just tell them that you're looking for the Steve Quayle package, the Steve Quayle special, and you'll get all of those books for the special price of $99. Of course, we have each one of these available in the store for sale by themselves. If you want to buy just Genesis 6 Giants or the new Little Creatures book, I'm sure that we'd be happy to make those available to them too. Well, Steve, we've got about 5 minutes left here, and there's a question I just keep wanting to get to.
Let's go for it.
And it's the question of the Smithsonian. In your book, right towards the very beginning of True Legends, you tell a story that some people are familiar with, probably most people are not familiar with. Some people just call this the Great Smithsonian Cover-Up. Tell me about that.
Well, first of all, the Smithsonian was basically founded by a man named Smithson, obviously where you get the name Smithsonian, and he hired a gentleman named Powell, for instance, who was a pretty well-known expedition leader. Lake Powell is named after him, but he became the curator. He suffered from a thing called isolationism. He wouldn't allow the thought that there were other civilizations and or people that had the ability to, number one, travel by ship. He thought that everybody grew up in an isolated area, and some people call that isolationism. Some people call it uniformitarianism, but that's as opposed to diffusionism, where everybody went everywhere. And I think it's important to remind people that the Smithsonian, from its very beginning, had the official party line that was pretty much established by Powell. And he would not allow any conflicting evidence, although I do quote in there, there's one quote of his that basically says, I can't account for this stuff outside of, you know, a more advanced civilization and culture having generated it. In other words, he denies everything until the very end, and then he says, but I can't account for it. Everyone is familiar with the classic scene in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where obviously at the end, you know, after the Nazis and after the retaking of the Ark, and it's put into a crate and it's being taken down this massive, huge warehouse on a forklift and just placed in some indiscriminate spot in the warehouse out of the eyes of everyone to see. The reason the giant bones, now here's the bottom, here is I would say the definitive statement. The reason the Smithsonian does not allow the truth to come out on this is because giants would indicate that the biblical narrative is accurate and would totally undermine Darwinian evolution, okay? And if you know the history of anthropology, there are times when the anthropologists believe that the Piltdown Man and some of the Peking men and all these anthropological supposed species that existed, you know, they have the jawbone of something and they built a whole mythological creature around it. Well, if they can believe a lie then and perpetuate that lie and then only grudgingly admit it was false, what makes us think that they're telling the truth about anything? Good example. We're now seeing NASA. There was never water on the moon. Now there's once water on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
There was never water on Mars, yet they're finding there was water on Mars, you know. We're seeing all these hints, and you and I have talked about it, the alien agenda. Here's what's key. In every area that you and I have investigated or will investigate, wherever there's a military base, Tom, wherever there's a Catholic presence heavy, those are mystical, and there are also electromagnetic contact points like Sedona. Good night. They consider that one of the most important vortexes or power centers between dimensions in the world. Well, that's what Timothy Alberino and the film crew were down in Peru, all over Peru, basically tracking down. And I would say this, if you go out and it's a bright blue sky, you camp out in front of a known Stargate, and all of a sudden you've got an isolated weather war against you, obviously somebody or something was not happy with the presence. I won't say it's a supernatural thing, but it's certainly an unusual thing, and even the natives couldn't figure that one out.
Yeah, and you know, deities try to emulate God, so that how Israel in the Old Testament would follow God, and they would follow the cloud, right?
Correct.
God created what we could almost explain in chemistry, but he did it miraculously so that they would follow it. And the demons always try to emulate him. They always try to be like he is. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High. This is what they want, right? They want to be worshipped as gods. So it'd make great sense. In fact, in True Legends, you talk about the storm gods, and so there's mythology and storyline that go around that whole concept since forever that would make you then wonder. Timothy goes down. He's with a group of people. He's in an area that's supposed to be a portal. Beautiful weather all over the place, and a storm just decides to come right over the top of them and have a hissy fit because they are there. Of course, electromagnetism. They can read that in the ground. Like you mentioned, Sedona, it's off the chart. And that, of course, can also play a role in our weather patterns. We've only got 45 seconds left in this program, so I'm just going to have to beg you if you can at least come back one more time. We thought we would do 2 shows, then 3. I think we're going to have a 4th show, if you will.
I'll do it.
Okay. Folks, once again, wonderful being here on the set at Skywatch TV with my good friend Steve Quayle. You would think that with all of the years of and hundreds of hours of radio that you and I have done together, that we would have been in each other's presence before, but this is actually the first time that we've sat down next to each other, and this time I couldn't be happier to have him. And we're gonna when the Timothy Alberino, Steve Quayle Gen 6 products become available, you'll see them here.
The supernatural realm.
All right, we'll do a few minutes of a part 4 of the Tom Horn.
Whatever their
Steve
stickers
Quayle.
say, they'll all lose suction because their filters clog. But with up.
We'll play just a little bit more of that. Meanwhile, you can go to
Angels waging
freeamerican.com,
war
make
in the
a
unseen
donation.
realm.
Really
Global
appreciate your
events.
support.
Fulfilling biblical prophecy. Eternal life. What lies beyond mortality? From analyzing the paranormal from a biblical worldview to the discussion of cutting-edge science and technology, conspiracy, discovery, special investigative reports. Unafraid to explore the challenging issues facing humanity. Welcome to another edition of Skywatch TV.
Hi folks, this is Tom Horn once again from Skywatch Television, and somehow, some way we were able to con my good friend Steve Quayle into staying here and doing another program. Actually, you couldn't con Steve into doing anything. He stayed by his good graces. Hi Steve, good to see you again.
Tom, well, I'm excited to be here. Now, I don't mind, you know, I'm serious. I think you and I could sit here and talk for like 8 hours straight, and people would be fascinated because we'd start here, go to another point in the universe, come back to where we were, and we would be all over the place. But by the end of the show, people would be going, how did they get from there to here? But we're here, you know?
Yeah, which is interesting because we've been talking about portals. We've been talking about Cern. Somehow we kind of create our own traversable wormholes during a program. We bend space and then come back to the beginning somehow. And speaking of that, that is what we left off the last program, talking about portals. Now, you've written these books. Your newest book is Little Creatures, and it's associated with that idea that there are doorways and that things can and do come through those doorways. You and I both believe not only do they come through the doorways, but a time is coming when prophecy says those gates are going to be fully opened, and then it's going to be like the floodgates of literally hell on earth is going to spill over into the earth. Do you think that what's going on right now at Cern, as we're sitting here talking, Cern has fired up its engines, it's getting ready to conduct the most powerful experiments ever done on the face of the earth by colliding literally hundreds of millions of particles together at just under the speed of light. But Cern's own director, he said, we may open a doorway and we may send something through it, or something may come through from a parallel universe. What in the world are these guys trying to accomplish?
Well, the late friend of both of ours, David Flynn, when he would write about the Ouroboros, I was interesting that we would be talking about this because CERN, in the dimension of the particle accelerator, is a type, actually, of the Ouroboros. And the image that I was given one day when I was just praying about this out of the blue is, imagine a time tunnel with two funnels, CERN being on the earthly side and the Ouroboros being the heavenly side.
And the Ouroboros, for those that don't understand, is this serpent swallowing its tail. It's an ancient symbol.
It's an ancient symbol, but it's based on the Milky Way and its motion. But the point being, Tom, is that when you have the head of CERN making that type of announcement, you know, it absolutely should cause people to take note. Now, some have taken note. I was contacted by a group of scientists through a third party claiming that they're seeing entities. And when you hear that it's been shut down for a crumb or some other hokey excuse, no, that's not the case. I can tell you, one time it was shut down, somebody intervened, okay? I don't know who, but somebody intervened, obviously God, and used a group of individuals to do it. And interestingly enough, they claim they were able to gate in and gate out. Some people won't believe that. But here's the thing. CERN is absolutely an affront to the living God. They actually believe, the Luciferians, Illuminati, that they're going to make war against God and they're going to prevail. They're going to prevail using fallen angel technology. Well, if it couldn't keep the fallen angels in heaven the first time, it's not going to see the finals time.
Yes, sir.
This is what people don't understand.
Oh, I dialed the wrong number.
Okay.
Sorry about that, Clay.
No problem, bud.
Tanks and missiles and
Okay.
lasers
Bye-bye.
and space weapon systems and alien technology. It is a supernatural weapon. Even the Bible teaches that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. A stronghold exists in the supernatural realm. And as we're dealing with CERN and Shiva, the destroyer, I find it interesting that the symbology of CERN is the Hindu deity Shiva, and the cosmic dance of creation and destruction. Now, of course, on the destruction, I think they're trying to get up to an interesting number, 13 trillion electron volts, 13 TeVs, okay? Well, when they rev to that TeV, I don't think they're going to understand and be able to contain the unintended consequence. Now, again, if people would get this through their mind, especially Christians, we're seeing it with the persecution all over the world, that there is now the global release of a supernatural evil not known to this degree across the whole world. It's like everything is a timepiece with all the sprockets, gears, balance wheels or imbalance wheels all functioning, and it's all turning in essence those giant tumblers on the vault of all the supernatural coming into our dimension.
Now that's interesting. That's kind of what I'm feeling right now when I talk about the nightmares that I'm going through. And these, we're going to finish that article in a couple of days. The nightmares are here. Just had a fraud on here telling me he was Paul Pantone, trying to convince me that if I didn't listen to what he says or put him up on the air, that he was going to, he wouldn't be on my show anymore. And this is the way God works on the internet. I've told you that God's alive and well on the internet. The phone rang, and it was Paul Pantone. Whoops, sorry, Clay, wrong number. No problem, bud. You called at exactly the right time. God bless you all. Go to freeamerican.com. Keep an eye on it. There will be more added, more added, more added. I am Clay Douglas. I am the Free American. You guys have a great day.